We're in Fairhope, Alabama on May the 3rd. We're at the Public Library, and our interviewee for the Veterans History Project connected with the Library of Congress is Glenn B. Stephenson. And he's a veteran of the Korean War with a most interesting background. And we're going to let you start this morning, Mr. Stephenson. He's also a retired professor of geography. So, and tell us a little bit about your family background, getting into the service, and your service.
Okay, I guess I better start now then. I think a good place to start would be how I came to be a part of the Korean force of the U.S. Army. I was in college at the time of the Korean War when it started in 1950. I was about halfway through my college career, and it was quite a unstable time in Korea. The Chinese had come in large numbers, and there was a good many Americans that were being killed and wounded at the time, and there was no telling where things would end up. The government gave those of us in college an opportunity to defer our entry into the Army by taking a deferment test, and if we passed, we would get, I think it was a 1-year deferment. I took the test because I had no great desire to rush into the Korean War. I had friends that were in the war. My best friend actually had left college early, and he became a second lieutenant in the infantry, and he came back and told me about combat and various aspects of the war. So I applied. I was going to get my bachelor's degree in 1951. I actually was graduating in August because of the fact that I went through a 4-year college in 3, and in August I was to graduate. Well, anyway, I received a deferment and applied for an MA degree in geography at Ohio State University. And that's what I did for the following year after graduation, putting off the Korean War responsibility, hoping the war would end and I wouldn't have to go there in a combat role, since I had no great sympathy for the Korean War and our support of the Syngman Rhee government, who was, like many we've supported, corrupt and just a kind of supported by the landlords in southern Korea, who kept a feudal society in place, and I wasn't about to put my life, hopefully, to support that kind of situation. On the other hand, I had no choice. I was being drafted, and I, had no choice but to go. But anyway, I was put off a year, and then I was called up for duty the following August, and I left with a small group of draftees from our town and surrounding area. I knew some of them because I'd gone to high school with them, and some of them had also been deferred, but some were just people I knew in the community in the surrounding area. Anyway, we were sent to Buffalo, where I was sworn in, and then a bus to Worcester, Massachusetts, where I remember sitting on the steps of the train station there. Actually, as I got off the train, sitting there and thinking about what my future would be, given the fact that I was not particularly interested in going into any kind of a combative role, but that I was there and I had to serve. And I saw it also as a kind of an adventure, because after all, it does, right after, well, I should really backtrack a bit and talk about why I was rather apprehensive, not necessarily about combat, but about where I would be in the Army. Well, anyway, let's forget that for the moment and say that in Fort Devens, I took a battery of tests to determine my eligibility for a variety of training schools, and turned out that I'd scored very high in the officer's candidate test, and I could have pursued that route and gone to Fort Benning, Georgia, probably, and become an infantry or some kind of an officer in the Army. But that would mean I'd have to be in the Army, which I think was probably a 3-year stint, and I was not eager to spend 3 years in the Army. We were enlistees. We could serve only 2 years, and then we could be let go. So I said, no, better to be an enlisted man and serve 2 years, and an officer and serve 3 years. And also, officers were being shot rather rapidly over in Korea, as my friend was telling me about the kind of thing that was going on there by not only the enemy, but by some of their own men who disliked them intensely, or whatever. I don't know what the reasons, but he said there was quite a bit of that going on. Anyway, they decided that I should go to the Signal Corps, and that's where I went. And out of Fort Devens, I took an airplane. I was put on an airplane down to Camp Gordon, Georgia, which is just outside of Augusta. And we had 8 weeks of basic training, which everyone got. And then the next 8 weeks were to be in some Signal Corps school. There were quite a number of schools, and of all things, I was assigned to a school which was a power equipment maintenance school, which had to do with maintaining the generators and so on. I had no mechanical ability that I was aware of. I had no experience with anything like some of the soldiers there were, of course, spent their life learning about cars and mechanics and so on. And I felt like a real fish out of water. And I said, what happened to this classification system? It didn't seem to make much sense to me. I found out that there was only one other soldier in this class that I was in, and he was a graduate of Yale. Of course, by that time, I had a master's from Columbia University, and we both commiserated and said, how could this have happened? But it did happen. So I started this school, and the first week or two dealt with the mechanics of electricity, and it was all kind of paperwork where you could learn these things and then take exams, and that was very easy for me and very difficult for a lot of these men who weren't used to that kind of work. But then the next stage was going down to the where the diesel engines were, and I was underneath a diesel engine, wondering what, I didn't know a thing about engines, and I didn't particularly interested in engines, and suddenly a soldier appeared, and he said, "The captain wants to see you right away," the captain of the school that I was in. And I said, "Well, okay," but I had no idea what he wanted to see me for. I went to his office, and he said, "How would you like to become the curriculum person for the school, write up the school curriculum," which hadn't been done apparently. He must have seen my records and saw that I had quite a bit of experience in education. And I said, "Great." I said, I would like to do that. That sounds quite interesting. But I asked him the question, will this keep me out of Korea? And just for sake of information, he said, sure it will. I said, that's good. I like the school. I like being in Camp Gordon because I met a girl in Augusta, and she seemed very nice, and I could spend time with her, and it seemed like an interesting way to put in my 2 years. Well, I set about writing up these the curriculum for the school, and I had to work with a sergeant who was kind of an uneducated, cocky young man, and he felt that I invaded his territory, so that wasn't very smooth. But anyway, I was there doing that for a few weeks, and then the captain called me in and said, he says, "I want to do this, but I got to put you on a levy for Korea." And I said, "What happened?" I said, "How come you promised me to keep me here, and now you're putting me on a levy for Korea?" He said, "Well, the Chinese are killing a lot of Americans, and they just need replacements." And the problem really was that you're supposed to have an MOS, a military occupation specialty. Every soldier gets one, whether you're in the infantry or whatever school, and I was supposed to have one. But since I didn't really I only spent the first week in the school, I never graduated from it, therefore I didn't have an MOS. So I said, "What about that? What are they going to put down for me?" He says, "Well, don't worry about that." And he sort of fobbed me off, so anyway, I went home for a leave, and then I went to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey to get ready to get shipped to Korea. And we were, after a few days of fun in New York City with some friends that I had met in the service, and they were already out of it. And I was ready to start this journey, which was a 35-day trip from New Jersey to Korea on a troop ship, which I look forward to it because I thought, it's kind of interesting being on the ocean for a long time. It was also a chance to see some of the Orient, which I never would have been able to do otherwise. So I was feeling pretty positive, but I was also feeling quite unsure of what they were going to do with me once I got there, because I was thinking, well, if I don't have an MOS, they'll probably just put me in the infantry. That was my feeling. So anyway, after some time in Japan and spending some time with a former girlfriend of mine who actually I met at Ohio State, and she was over in Japan teaching elementary school at one of the Army bases, so she was able to get me a leave, so we had a fun day in Tokyo. But anyway, I was on the ship, and we ended up in the port city of Incheon in Korea, which had been captured from the North Koreans at a previous time. And it seemed very kind of tranquil. The birds were singing. It was like, I think it was like a March day. It was a very clear day, and I was coming to the conclusion, well, this is peaceful, but it won't be for long. And I was thinking that maybe I would be in the trenches up around the 38th parallel in Korea, since I didn't have an MOS. So anyway, my orders at the time was to join a Signal Corps battalion, or whatever they called it up there. I guess it was an engineering company, and I was supposed to be dealing with diesel engines. And I thought, well, this doesn't add up at all. So I got our train, which is a little narrow gauge train, was loaded up with troops. Many of them were going up to join battle in a few weeks, whenever they'd be fighting the Chinese. It's just an abrupt change like that. And but in the meantime, I was dropped off in Seoul, the capital of Korea, where I was to meet with the Signal Corps operations officer, who was going to talk to me and assign me and send me on to this engineering company someplace in the north. So he was sitting in his desk, I remember he was a big, kind of burly guy. He had all these stripes on his, he was like a master sergeant. And he picked my records out, and he said, I see you're going to the Signal Corps diesel, whatever, company up north of here. And I was thinking, what should I say to him? Should I tell him the truth? Or shall I risk being shifted off into the infantry, which I had no desire to do? So I finally decided, well, I'm just going to take a gamble. I said to him, look, you have my records here, but I have no MOS, I have no training in diesel engines, and it would be really ridiculous to send me up there. And he said to me, he says, can you type? And I said, well, sure, I can type. And I didn't type very well, but I could do some typing. He said, well, all right, I'm going to send you to the 8th Army headquarters right here in Seoul, and you can join the signal operations branch of it. I said, fine. I said, I'd be glad to do that. So the unit was sited right in the campus of Seoul University, and we were billeted. Our billet was where we lived was like a high school classroom, or a high school actually. But we walked back and forth to work, which wasn't very far. I spent some time there in a rather menial job, just typing codes and then proofreading them. It was dreadfully boring, and I wasn't too happy with that. But then the master sergeant, his name was Kilpatrick, as I recall, he said to me, how would you like to type the report of the commanding general of the Signal Corps? We have to do it every month. And he said he's not very smart, which I found was quite true. He was barely literate. And he said he doesn't like you to make a lot of changes in it, and it's got to be 5 copies, and there could be no erasures. So you've got to type this up in a week's time or less, and he says you really got to edit it somewhat, because he's almost an illiterate person. So I set about doing that. My typing improved some, and I managed to get it out, this report, once a month. I did that for 2 or 3 months, and then the war was over at that point. The fighting was over anyway, and I decided, well, I'd like to join the Army Education Center, which was over in the Han River, about 2 or 3 miles from there, and get out of this kind of, well, it wasn't so boring once I was doing the reports, but it was still kind of nerve-wracking, I guess you could say. So I thought, I want to get to the Army Education Center, which I knew a little bit about. So I went over there and said, do you have a job for me here? And they said, yeah, we could find a place for you here. There was a captain there who was an interesting guy. He was kind of he was a salesman in his life before he was brought back into the Army. He didn't know much about education, and in fact he spent most of his life just there socializing with some of the women that he found. So, and then there was a lieutenant who was really a nice guy, but he didn't really know anything about education, and he was ill-equipped. So it ended up that I was practically running the 8th Army Education Center, which meant that I had to deal with correspondence courses of soldiers. I had to arrange for some university professors coming over teaching classes there. We also offered certain classes so some of our men there could get their high school diplomas, and we offered college courses also. So it was I became kind of the administrator of the whole thing, and that was a very interesting job.
Now, who were you teaching? If the war was over,
Yeah.
the troops
Well,
were going home.
these were men basically who were in 8th Army headquarters, and that included quite a lot of men, because I mean, there was several thousand of them in the 8th Army headquarters, and they were in the immediate area, so they come in and take these classes.
Right.
It wasn't, so we had plenty of people who wanted to do this because they were bored too. The war was over and they had jobs that weren't too interesting, so if they could take a course, so on, it worked out very well. So that was my time in the Army. There wasn't much in the way of combat to it. Well, in fact, I was, quite far away from it. I did meet with soldiers who came in that were in combat and talked to them. I found out that in our infantry squads in Korea, about 1/3 were actually Korean. About 1/3 were blacks, and maybe 1/3 were kind of what you call the poor, uneducated whites, who they sent off to the infantry because, you know, they drafted these men in the army, and they didn't have these specialized skills, so they were really infantry fodder, you might say. And I might say a word or two about Seoul when I was there. It had been captured and recaptured a couple of times from the North Koreans and the Chinese, and that it was really a city which was like a ghost town. And I think at that time it must have had over 1 million people. Now, I don't know, it's a very large city. You may have seen pictures of it. There were no street lights. There was no restaurants. There was nothing there. Everything was bombed out. The Capitol was bombed, and most of the buildings were bombed out. And so even though we were in a city, there was no place to go for any entertainment or things that it was all in we had individual clubs. There was engineering club, and there was an 8th Army headquarters club, and so on. And they brought in girls to dance and so on. But at that point, it was quite a devastated city. And you look at it now, you see all these flashing lights, and you know it's like a hard to describe, but it's a very vibrant city. That who would ever think that when we were over there that it would come to be this way, and who would ever think that that the Koreans, who I liked them. We had an office girl who was Korean, and she was very nice, and but you know, they were considered kind of inferior by most American soldiers there because we were there to, in a sense, to save them. I guess they might look at it that way, and now I pick up a newspaper and I see that a person in the New York Times who was comes from a very wealthy family who actually owns Sears and Roebuck. He's getting married to a Korean woman. Of course, she has advanced degrees from all kinds of places, and they have a similar education level. But who would ever think that this would eventuate in this kind of much different kind of world now than it was 50, 60 years ago? Do you have any questions you want to ask me?
In terms of the development of Korea, the North did not develop. Of course, we poured huge amounts of money. Were you there when they began the foreign aid programs?
No, there was nothing there because the war was only over, and I was only there about, say, 3 or 4 months when the fighting had stopped, and there was no aid, no help. It was all very wartime, stark devastation kind of thing.
And also I was struck by the fact that even though you described the background of the infantry as very low education, they were trying, through your efforts and others, to raise that, to do something for the draftees or the army.
Yes, I don't know if they were doing that particularly for those up on the front lines. I think the 8th Army headquarters was a very special kind of place where you could provide this kind of services, and a lot of the men there were beyond that lower level of education, at least, and because you had to have some kind of a specialty really to work in 8th Army headquarters, and therefore they did make provision for these men to further their education, but they did it on all levels. They did it on the college level and the high school level.
Well, any reflections that you would want to talk about on your experiences? Anything further, or?
Anything further? I don't know, how much have I used of my allotted time?
Well, we're about 40 minutes.
Oh, well, looks like. I guess I could say a few words about my feeling about fighting for whatever it was in Korea. I came from a family which were very much not supportive of the elite and their privileged positions in the world. My father was a socialist and a big supporter of FDR and so on. And therefore, with both my reading and being around him, I didn't have any patriotic feeling about whatever we were doing. In fact, I thought that we were just going there to kind of shore up and buttress the feudal society, which was a part of South Korea particularly. And I had some sympathy actually for the communists who were there to upturn the system and gives a little more opportunity for people at a lower level. Of course, they did turn out to be brutal in a sense, but war is brutal, and I guess revolutions turn out to become brutal, and that's a part of things we've got to realize where we go in the world. Whatever group we're going to support, if it's for democracy, well, that's a very loose word. I don't know quite how you can define democracy in many ways, and certainly just going to support a elite in some country is not my idea of supporting democracy. And therefore I had it wasn't just that I didn't want to be in combat necessarily. I had very strong feelings that we were doing things with our great amount of money that we devote to militarism and support around the world for unsavory countries' leaders. Even back then, I felt that I didn't have a strong feeling that this was worthy of support. And also, one other thing on this is that when I went in the Army, I went in as an individual, and I went to Korea as an individual, and in other words, I didn't go with any group. Even when I was mustered out of the Army from Korea, I didn't go with any friends or any groups, because everything was individual, rotating. You know, you were in there for so many months, and then you're gone. And those that remain, they have to put in their time, and then they're gone. And then, you know, this is a constant kind of change. So you had no feeling of unit support. I suppose some men up on the front lines that were in the infantry had some kind of a mutual feeling towards each other because they were trying to save their lives and it depended on each other. But back where we were, you know, I had good friends there, very good friends that I kept up with. One was an opera buff, and he had another friend from New York City who was an opera buff. And I didn't know very much about opera at that time, but they'd sit and talk about them, and I got very interested, and therefore I became interested in opera and classical music. That started when I was back in graduate school. I had a friend there that introduced me to classical music. So, coming back to the Army, you know, it wasn't all bad. I had great experiences. You know, I went to Japan twice on R&R. I toured all of Tokyo, and then the second time I toured Kyoto. I met some very interesting women there. I also met others. I met a Swiss Army captain who was there for some reason, supervising, I guess, the negotiations for peace. So, you know, it provided experiences which were very different from a more rural kind of experience growing up in a smaller town and going to a college which did have a lot of students from Long Island and so on, so it wasn't really very rural, but my world was quite small anyway at that point. And the Army did give me an opportunity to experience all these things. And I'd just like to close by saying that even though I have some disagreements about warfare, I don't really believe in war anymore. I didn't believe in it then very much. I don't believe going to war solves anything. I think that we rush into war without thinking. We did it in Iraq and suffered the consequences, and we've done it before. I do appreciate Obama's reluctance to get into war with Libya. Of course, that's partly because he has two wars going on already, Afghanistan and the Iraq war still. Well, it's not a war, but he's involved in committing huge sums of money. So, you know, we're spending trillions and trillions of dollars on these war escapades, and yet our own citizens are suffering lack of education, a lack of infrastructure, and so on. It's an awful thing that we've committed and way overcommitted ourselves to the military, which gets, people don't know, that it gets $700 billion a year, $700 billion.
Okay, so
okay, that's enough of that. That's enough of that.
Reluctant military person, but you did serve, and you served with a commitment there while you were there. You did not flee to Canada. No. You were an American citizen.
And I did my job.
And did your job. And so we so much appreciate your summary.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.